I think spiritually, something in me also snapped when, as churches, we were commanded by the hierarchy to to evacuate. This is rather ridiculous. Message that went around that we had to evacuate immediately our church buildings and only return to them for health and safety reasons.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, I sit down with Reverend Daniel French, an Anglican priest, author and commentator. Daniel co-hosts the popular podcast Irreverend that began during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns.
This was something disturbing. This was a break in the way of normal operations. We hadn't had a lockdown in the Second World War, and yet here we were.
He says one of the biggest issues of our time is the replacement of humanity with artificial intelligence.
This is coming very fast. This is coming at the speed of months, but I can tell you that the AI apocalypse could be 2026. Why are we not? Why are senior churchmen not shouting from the rooftops about this? So, what do I think about all the sort of climate stuff coming from the church? I think there are other apocalypses to worry about.
I'm Lee Hall, and this is British Thought Leaders. Daniel French, welcome to British Thought Leaders.
Thank you very much, Lee, for having me.
So you are vicar of the seaside town of Salcombe and also host of the popular Irreverend podcast. Can you tell us a bit about how the podcast started up and what it's all about?
Well, a very strange series of coincidences. I'd started writing for the Spectator, and the first article that I'd written, which had picked up on the struggles of the church during the lockdown, I think, and my own personal disappointment with the closure of churches. I mentioned Rod Dreher, the American commentator, author of The Benedict Option, Jordan Peterson, C.S. Lewis. It was a bit of a Jerry Maguire mission statement. I threw everything in. And Rod Dreher rang me up from America, which was really cool. I was about to do a PhD on this guy's thesis, so I was sort of blown away by this. And said, how can I serve you? And the most obvious thing was really connection, isn't it? That's always the way, isn't it? It's networking. So I got to know a number of people very quickly, which included, firstly, Jamie Franklin, and then Tom Pelham, his friend. And they began over a period of time to consider putting a podcast together because we'd had these wonderful long chats on Zoom, trying to get our heads around what was happening. Why was the church's response so subpar? So we were sort of therapy to each other, and those conversations then seemed to naturally lend themselves into this sort of podcast format. And I came a bit later to that, a few months in, and then by, I suppose, 2021, it started going a bit viral, and I think on Easter Day, actually, we trumped the Archbishop of York in his Lent series. Sorry, Archbishop, but anyway, that was kind of a moment where we thought, oh, this is for real.
Yeah.
People are listening into this, and we just kept the format very simple. For bit of scripture, analysis of current affairs, then some sort of theological deep digging, and what have you, and end with a prayer. And people seem to really warm to it. I mean, we've had Alison Pearson from The Telegraph saying, next to Planet Normal, where her favourite podcast, which is brilliant. Praise indeed. And I think we clearly touched upon concerns and also a migration of people, I think, which accelerated during lockdown, but I think had already been happening away from, say, new atheism and its promises to a return to, I think, I would call it a classical Christianity, with a high aesthetic, with a yearning for the supernatural and the sacramental, whether Catholic or evangelical. That there were people who were, in a sense, knocking at the door of churches and finding that when they, sadly, I mean, this actually gets me really riled up, actually, when folks during the lockdowns started having these, I suppose, religious experiences, that they went to their local vicar, and he or she rolled their eyes. I've had hundreds of those stories.
Right.
We don't do that sort of thing anymore. We're more into activism,
Right.
rather than, well, it's that line from Les Miserables, isn't it? Who cares for your tortured soul? We have a higher goal. And where do you go when your local vicar has just landed that on you? And it seemed that the podcast spoke to a constituency of new stay-at-home Christians, who still, many of us, there is still, I think, this unresolved issue, because we want them to find a home. We want them to find a spiritual place where they can flourish. But the vast majority are struggling. I actually think, in terms of numbers, if we've had in the last year or two, I think the three of us have probably had round about, let's say, several thousand stories like this. Either
people emailing.
People emailing, right. Post. I mean, the wife will say, "Oh, here's another fan mail for you." Telegram, Twitter groups, YouTube comments. And I've had people pick up the phone and say, I need to speak to someone. I need to speak to you, because this is where I've suddenly found faith in the Lord. If we're seeing that in an order of a couple thousand, and we're just, three random clergy, what is the actual number? I think it's probably in the hundreds of thousands who have come to this new place within themselves. And what's very frustrating is that the mainstream churches are not responding. In fact, much of their response is making these people allergic to the concept of church going, right. Which we want to, we don't want to create a digital church. Believe that in the end, that church is about human beings meeting, like you and I, in a room, talking, praying, sharing the cup, breaking the sacred loaf, so on. So we want to encourage that, but it's very frustrating when the powers that be and the theologians and what have you seem ambivalent to that. In fact, it would, if I were to be particularly critical, I would say that their search lamp is on a very narrow constituency who will never come to church on the whole. Politically left-leaning activist types who already consider Christianity, even if it was updated to their standards, beyond the pale. And we're spending millions as denominations trying to reach a constituency who are not interested, when the cavalry is coming over the hill.
The feedback you've had from the public has been good. What about the feedback from other members of the clergy?
Well, I'm in I suppose, in a unique situation, in that the parish I'm at is the most southerly, one of the most southerly in Britain. So I don't have the greatest mix with clergy in that respect. I think there's a mixed response. I think for some people it's been what we've been doing, podcasting. They'll see it as beyond the pale, because we're picking up issues and a direction which is not theirs. So we've had criticism that's at times been hilariously barbed. I think there was one cathedral canon who called us a postmodern freak show. I'll take that. Yeah, that's fine. But and I've had a few negative comments, but on the whole, clergy are sympathetic. Are on board with what we're doing. I mean,
Right.
sadly, a number feel that they can't say that too publicly, which I find absolutely bizarre. Because I don't think we're doing anything particularly too off the wall.
Around the time you joined the podcast was probably the second national lockdown during the pandemic. What effect did the pandemic have on you, and did it influence you agreeing to join the podcast?
Yeah. Instinctively, I couldn't get my head around it. There was that. I'd actually been listening a few weeks before that to Lord Sumption's lectures. And I think something he'd said about the Constitution stuck on me. Once something is lost or something is broken in the Constitution, it really is incredibly hard to repair. And I think that sense of civil liberty, which is sort of intrinsic to who we are, I think that snapped at that point. It's going to be very hard to justify not having some kind of different versions of this, whether it's ecological lockdowns or restrictions in the future. I think spiritually, something in me also snapped when, as churches, we were commanded by the hierarchy to evacuate. This is rather ridiculous message that went around, that we had to evacuate immediately our church buildings and only return to them for health and safety reasons, in terms of like checking the loos and the fire alarms. But otherwise it was far too dangerous to be there. And I can remember the day that the church warden gave me this, and I sat outside the church and wept. I thought, we have made an enormous blunder. How can we now argue that these spaces are liminal, sacramental, sacred spaces of healing? That what we do here is extraordinary. If we're just putting ourselves up as no different from the local gym, that we're just another lifestyle choice, and that this rather half-hearted, banal idea that, well, we can carry on the show, so to speak, by just phoning people up and having Zoom services. Now, there's part of me that kind of rather enjoyed that, because I come from a tech background. Great, I can get all the gear together and do some live streams. I didn't mind that. I did one every day, and it got great traction. And yet, it didn't feel right to be doing this. It didn't feel right to have instructions which pushed us in the direction of, say, it was unsafe to go and give someone the last rites. It was, and I think Tom and Jamie and myself kind of connected really profoundly on that. That this was something disturbing. This was a break in the way of normal operations. I mean, we hadn't had a lockdown in the Second World War, and yet here we were.
There's also talk of the vaccine passports to get into churches as well.
I think there was one or two cathedrals who tried that in the second lockdown for carol services. And I'd heard churches who were mooting with the idea of do you remember there were different zones, weren't they, for tiers, and that we should have signs outside our churches saying what tier we think it would be acceptable for someone to come to. And that was mooted at one point to me. And I said, I'll resign on the spot if you do it.
Do you think the church leadership failed a moral, if not spiritual, test with this issue?
Yeah. And I think though it would have been, I appreciate it would have been a mountain of difficulties to have been an alternate voice. Imagine if we had gone down that, and we had been the church that was nationally, along with other mainstream churches, sceptical about the closing of society, and particularly the closing of churches, and the whole thing of vaccine passports and beginning to delineate people into jabbed and unjabbed. If we'd have had ecclesiastical leadership that has stood and said no, I think many of us would have died on the hills for that leadership. And there is, I think, as I put in that first piece that I mentioned to you in The Spectator, I think there is a sense in which, say, for instance, Jordan Peterson, in his direct approach, speaking to people as if it were heart to heart, and being concerned for the soul. That's where our tanks should be parked. And subsequently, I think after the second and the third lockdown, when it became apparent that there was this incredible contagion of mental health issues, and that many, many people, particularly the young, were in a horrible, horrible state, that to have had a leadership that took that under their wing and said, let's help you get your house in order. Those on the political and theological left will say that's moralising. But if you're a pastor on the ground and you're doing your job, you'll know that that's what people want from you. That's what will be the most effective turnaround. But instead, what we can end up having is clergy who say, well, I'm too busy to deal with this. I've got some higher goal, which often is armchair philosophizing, rather than actually dealing with that. That pain was very close to the things of the spirit. So, what was frustrating is after each of these lockdowns, we had this opportunity to actually reset this. Yeah. But I think what often we got were banal missives about, there's a bit of a mental health issue, and isn't it a shame that the government doesn't provide more funding? All right, well, you've got a vicar in every parish who is about putting right the demons of the soul and mind. We've got what we need. Why aren't we mobilising these people to do this? Very frustrating.
Yeah. We've seen over the last decade particularly quite large changes, progressive values on the rise, people that don't toe the line with them getting attacked and cancelled. Quite a lot of these values are in opposition to what is taught in the Bible. And I wondered what challenges this has brought you as a faith leader.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really quite creepy about this is it's not so much the issues per hand, which are often about, say, personal lifestyle or identity. It's about the unforgiving nature of it. Though I was brought up by a faith church-going family, I think I came to faith round about 17, randomly opening the Bible one day, thinking I ought to really give this a go properly. And I fell upon, I think it's from the 5th or 6th chapter of St. Luke, love thy enemies. And I thought, well, here is a politique. Here's a way of living and engaging with the world, which is about as demanding as you could get. To take one for your adversary, to take that from Christ not as a suggestion but as a commandment and the means by which you will be judged. And I subsequently found that reading around the kind of progressivist narrative, that bit had been airbrushed out. That you had an attempt to have Christianity not only without God and all the nice stuff about us being, inclusive and caring, but it was going to be done in a way that if you disagreed with X, Y, and Z, you would be, to use that word, cancelled, put in the sort of public stocks, and that struck me as profoundly anti-Christian. To have a ideological movement which at its heart was unforgiving, and of which there would be no way that anybody could come back, is to me the antithesis of the Christian way. Dividing the world into them and us, which of course those binaries are very easy, aren't they, to take on? They're comfortable. It's what I would call a marvelization of the world. The goodies and the baddies. Yeah. There's superheroes and the villains. I love I grew up with those comics, but you can see that on an industrial scale, this has become a kind of cultural heresy that we are now teaching the generations to come to look at the world through that prism, and that the majority of the world's problems are out there rather than in here. Forgetting what Solzhenitsyn said about all the conflicts of the world going through every human heart, and he learned that through 10 years in the Gulag, and thanked the prison for coming to that truth, having gone through hell to find it, finds himself in that respect a free man. I think what we have instead is an ideology which could easily slip into becoming a religion of the self, like the mirror in the Snow White fairy tale, which shows us what we want to see. And then obviously at times, flips that round and shows us what we don't want to see. And is a circle of despair. Whereas I think the Christian story begins with, if you want to change the world, you can't, because it's Christ who is the main agent. He's the hero. But you also have to change yourself.
Yeah.
You have to learn that spiritual poverty. And we've got now, I think, the beginnings of a very acidic culture, which is not going to promulgate that at all. It's all about my truth and my lived experience, which is, complete nonsense.
We recently saw a member of Synod who was reported to the police by the bishop for hate crimes because he spoke out about pride events and also the sexualization of children. Are you seeing this kind of split between the governing body of the church and vicars that don't want to toe the line?
Yeah, I think that the narrative as well is there are things you can get away with saying in one end of the theological spectrum that you can't in the other.
Right.
And there seems to be much more forgiveness. It would be okay for like the curate a couple of years ago who can diss Captain Tom.
Oh yeah.
But if you were to make a comment on the other end, like you've just mentioned, all hell breaks loose. And I think the ecclesiastical authorities are still struggling with how to. They struggle with things like Twitter, for instance, and how to have good disagreement, and they easily forget that Twitter is about quite robust discussion. I mean, General Synod used to be about real argy-bargies, and there's a way to do that, I think, which can be constructive without it getting toxic. But I don't think the church does itself any favours if it only tolerates argy-bargy on one side. The Church of England's reputation, and here I'm speaking for my own denomination, used to be that it was a household of the most wonderful eccentrics. You had balmy bishops, crazy canons, and some of these people were often the holiest men and women of God. That they and their writings will be with us, I think, for centuries, and their impact. That the danger now is that we end up with a very managed intake.
Right.
Where I was thinking of this morning about Chad Vara, who founded the Samaritans. A giant of a man. I don't think he would get through the selection process to be a vicar. But so we've lost something.
Like a homogenization.
Yeah, it's a homogenization, and it's throughout the C of E. There is a move to a much more corporate managerial style, and so those kind of prophetic voices are on either the sort of the liberal or the conservative side are largely gone now. And I think there's a real loss in that, actually, and it's become a little less fun.
There's some kind of sense of getting involved with the latest issue. Like we saw the Archbishop of Canterbury talking about climate justice, and we're in right near the kind of point of no return. And his predecessor organised a multi-faith ceremony to repent for climate sins. And we can see the same in society. Everyone's getting on board with the latest issue, the green agenda. So I think the church is kind of following along in the same way.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I'm thinking of the line from that great film, Wallace and Gromit. You've got the wrong trousers. It's the wrong apocalypse. I'm increasingly becoming ambivalent. I have to say, Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil are pushing me more and more into the other direction. And you have to understand I'm 15 miles away from Totnes, which is the sort of intellectual centre of the new age, and is in the midst of all of this as well. And there is a certain type, really. I've got nothing against conservationism, long-term decarbonisation of the economy. There seem to be very sensible things to do. That we clearly would have a limit on how much, say, petroleum and gas there is for our civilization. We could make a covenant with ourselves to at one point say, well, we're going to store this in case of an emergency, because you can reboot a society on petrol in 50 years. It's very difficult if all you've got solar panels, to go back to that if you've had a massive global disaster. So that, I can see some sense in that. I think, like Elon Musk has said, he's not convinced of the alarmist argument. And here's the man who's provided the world with electric cars. I'd say I was pretty much on his page on this. And yet I think we miss the other apocalypses that are just around the corner. In fact, as churches, we seem to be intensely silent, which is, again, extraordinary. Consider, I think it's there's a world body of actuaries who've calculated that in the next couple of years, there's a 20% chance that a nuclear weapon could be released in Europe. 20%. We should not be. Now, where are the churchmen speaking up against that? There is a 5% chance of a nuclear war. That's extraordinary. We should know, where are all these priests who were in CND? Where are they? Why aren't they speaking out at this point? I don't understand that at all. And then, of course, there's the the next one, which is gaining traction in the advent of ChatGPT, the AI potential. Now, here it strikes me that there is a conversation of which the church has enormous fluency about, because I think the AI is in itself a Tower of Babel. It fits to many of the biblical tropes. We have something I think quite profound to say in that our religion is about God becomes one of us. The Word became flesh. If we are if we are in a society where we are rejecting, in a sense, our humanity for something else, surely that's one of the most natural places for us to speak into and to get expertise, to be able to be fluent and if necessary fiery about this. And yet it's radio silence. I'm sure there's one or two committees somewhere in each of our denominations who've had some sort of tea and sandwiches over this, but we should be declaring an emergency from the pulpits, because I think this is in many ways undergirds a spiritual conflict. I worked a little bit in the industry, and I've got a computer science degree. 30 years ago I studied neural networks, vision recognition systems, robotics, and even then, was taking in sharp breaths at what this potentially could do.
Yeah.
It is not so much the creation of some sort of global Skynet, though that could happen, but it is more, and I think again Musk is sort of pointing this out, it's the creation of a sort of AI termite that can just flood the world with misinformation, misdiagnosis, could potentially take control of various things, social media, deep fake reality to us. If the average teenager is spending 8 hours in front of a phone and may soon be wearing Apple visors, how do we check that AI isn't completely morphing reality for us, giving us that snow white mirror that we so eagerly want to see, which is in many ways goes back not even to the Tower of Babel, goes back further, doesn't it, to the forbidden fruit. It's that which we are not ready for. I think this is coming very fast. This is coming at the speed of months, whereas the you look at the net zero goals as sort of say to 2050, that with if you take it on board, a sort of a climate emergency, you're looking towards the end of the 21st century. People are saying where it could be catastrophic. I don't know, but I can tell you that the AI apocalypse could be 2026. Why are we not? Why are senior churchmen not shouting from the rooftops about this? This is exactly something that we can speak into with knowledge, and I think a courageous conviction is needed at this point. So, what do I think about all the sort of climate stuff coming from the church? I think there are other apocalypses to worry about, and we could have a disproportionate over concern on this, and in doing so also encourage a kind of rush to a solution which puts people in poverty. And let's be honest, isn't that we've seen from the lockdown that our society can easily be now divided into those who can work from home comfortably and those who cannot. Had I think there's a whole section of society that would have thrown a complete tantrum had Amazon not been delivering to them.
Yeah.
And so, it's okay for those people to take the brunt of the pandemic, as long as I'm safely in my home, having my granola, my Amazon packages, and my Zoom calls. Like with the Brexit vote, I think this highlighted a division within society that is quite profound, and again, one that the churches are not speaking into. I've heard senior clergy sit and curl their lips at the Daily Mail, for instance, or the tabloid newspaper. Okay, fair enough. But what is that as a solution? How does that reach out to ordinary people who are looking at their gas and electricity bills and thinking, what am I going to have to stop eating?
Yeah.
I think that there's a great danger in that we don't speak to that, because again, it's Christianity, I think, it is a profound rejection of a utilitarian, machine-like view of reality, where there are expendables, or to use Hillary Clinton's term, deplorables. People that we can put under the carpet and forget about conveniently. And it strikes me as one of the top priorities of the gospel is to turn that upside down. Our religion in the first century was largely populated by the lower castes of Roman society, and it strikes me as though we can easily have a mainstream denomination which says that it has this bias for the poor, but the reality can't stomach much interaction with them.
So, looking at Christianity in Britain more on a whole, from 2010 to 2019, we saw, I think, the loss of over 400 churches. And then we got the census in 2022, which showed church going at an all-time low, and Christians becoming a minority for the first time, as far as I know. So I wanted to ask you about something that I know is an interest of yours. Could Christianity become a kind of underground belief, possibly like monk-like communities, people sealing themselves off from the secular society?
In one sense, it's already happening.
Right.
That there are, I think, networks of clergy and churches. There are networks, I think, of professional Christians who are negotiating very difficult work situations, that if they put their head above the parapet, say particularly in academia, they're going to get shot down and cancelled. So I think there are already networks beginning in the very early days. But do I think that this might be the way that the churches end up, say, in 20, 30 years? Sadly, yes. I think that we have a culture which is morphing into a strange melange of Brave New World, Lewis's Hideous Strength, with elements of Orwellianism in it, a kind of digital surveillance society. And I think we're just beginning to see what the precipice looks like. And that such a society in itself becomes a new orthodoxy, a religion, and becomes the state religion. And in that respect, it's not going to tolerate anything else. So, yes, I think that the exciting, energized forms of Christianity will be, I use the word subterranean. I don't mean in catacombs, literally, but I think they will be across small groups, vibrant churches that are going to keep their nerves and have thick walls to the outside world, churches that make real and profound demands on people and invest heavily in spiritual formation. I think a lot of that will be a lot more discreet. If you think that in the 3rd century, if you were going to become a catechumen in the church in the Roman Empire, you'd have had to have been vetted for maybe a year or so before they even let you see a presbyter preaching, let alone the Holy Eucharist. I don't necessarily think we'll go full whack back to those days, but I think it's going to be much more about us being as wise as the serpent and innocent as the dove in terms of our public profile. That may actually make us, paradoxically, a magnetic, attractive community. That if the door in is very narrow, and people can see that there is something life-changing in those networks, and so from the outside decide to journey in. And when they do so, are actually asked of something is asked of them, that they are asked to, let's say, understand the cost of being a believer in the 21st century. Understand that the art that they're going to have to take on is the ability to suffer well for their faith, which, in somewhere like Britain might be losing all respectability, never getting the professional job that you probably deserve because of your opinions. I mean, that's already happening. So I think, yes, there will be a natural coagulating of people who are in that situation, and these are going to be the energized and exciting communities. They're going to be the ones that are going to be writing theology, not in academia, in sort of professional religious studies departments. It's going to be written in these base communities, in a sense of Christianity. Now,
where I'm from in the Midlands, there's a place called Mount St Bernard's Abbey, and it's a Cistercian community, is a strict order. So they all took a vow of silence. They make beer and honey and sell it, and you can go there, and it's just the most. It has an almost otherworldly kind of magical quiet to it. You can go there and read your book, buy some honey, and just enjoy the grounds. I feel a bit envious of them sometimes, to be honest.
Well, I think that's going to be one of the things that we're going to have to learn to do well, is to be able to offer to society places and encounters and networks, communities, which may look weird, but actually are places of solace, places of renewal, communities which offer spiritual encouragement. They're probably increasingly going to look nuts, and I suppose part of the real difficulty for these churches is going to be actually ensuring that they don't become sectarian cults. That they have to be places where, yes, there is this intense renewal. There's this big investment in the Christian faith, more so than perhaps has been before, but also those communities are porous. That people can come in and see and understand what is happening and grow from that. That's going to take I think a considerable amount of wisdom, because the charge will be, there's this funny bunch doing this strange, weird stuff. I mean, the patterns are already beginning. You can see that. I think really nobody under 40 is going to a church that isn't a bit otherworldly and weird. There is a resurgence in, for instance, the 1662 prayer book, particularly in millennials and younger,
Right.
because that Cranmerian language really asks something of you. It asks you to put aside the devices and desires of your own heart. It asks you to give it the time that it deserves. And there, I suppose there's great renewal, certainly in the Pentecostal movement, in the charismatic churches, within Roman Catholicism. The whole Latin Mass thing has really seemed to have gripped a much younger generation in a way that I'd have never imagined happening, say, 30 years ago. So Christianity, I think, will look increasingly different, and maybe that can be part of its appeal and its unique selling point, and why not? And I think we should do well as as shepherds of the church to go with that, actually, and not be afraid of that. My own sort of personal encounters with people, particularly that the generations coming up, is they really rather relish that, actually, and find that exciting and interesting. Who wants to just follow a bland, undemanding version of Christianity that is decaf and just gives you a series of woke tropes? I mean, it's Tom Holland, the historian, didn't it? He said that the Church of England needs to stop being the Liberal Democratic Party conference at prayer. At least with the Liberal Democrats, for the greatest respect, you don't have to go on at church on a Sunday morning. You just go to conference and party meetings. But we need to do something different, I think, now, and take a different approach and be courageous. And I think we'll be surprised at the response.
We're looking at Eastern European countries, especially those that came from the post-Soviet era. Christianity is on the rise there. I wonder what your thoughts are on why that is. I don't know if there's some credence to this idea that hardship pushes people towards faith, maybe.
Yeah. If you've had to suffer for it, then you understand the value of it. I have a number of friends who grew up during that period, whose families stuck to Christian worship and did so at great cost. One of my friends, his father, who was an academic, a philosopher, laughed when a member of the Communist Party at a meetup of the party. This is like 1946 in Czechoslovakia. The party would come into the universities and say, "This is the new script." And in this talk, the guy got incredibly excited and started to say that in the future, the Communist Party will be able to direct even the weather. Well, my friend's father laughed at this point. And of course, that brought attention on him. Next day, he and colleagues lost their jobs, worked in a factory for the rest of his life. His brothers became clergy in the underground church. And he and others were lambasted for their faith. But something shone from their home and others. People who did keep the Christian faith. Their neighbours knew that here was a place of compassion. Here were people who were willing to walk the extra mile. Here were people who, when things went crazy, you could go to and get consolation and practical help. And the party could never take that away. So hopefully they're still working through that legacy. They've got something to fall back on, to understand and to cherish. I mean, Rod Dreher, in his book Live Not by Lies, talks about Father Tomislav Kolakovic, who I think, if I remember rightly, from Croatia, when the Nazis left, warned the official church, the communists are coming. I've studied them. I've lived in the Soviet Russia. I know what this is going to be like. and they all laughed it off. It was alarmist, and within a year or so, communists sweep in, and the official church is essentially neutered.
Yeah.
And this went throughout Eastern Europe. Kolokovic was very clever as a sort of entrepreneurial catechist. He went from place to place, founding these small house groups. They could be Catholic, evangelical, whatever. I think it emerged that when the Berlin Wall came down, that the natural leaders were the people in these communities. I think there were several hundred of them. It's an extraordinary unknown stories. It's surprising that Rome has never actually canonized him. But I think, what we can get from him is certainly an understanding that if you come out saying this, you will be treated by the official organs of the church most likely as some sort of alarmist heretic nut job. But I think Kolokovic tells us to don't worry about that, ignore it, plough on.
Looking at countries where Christianity is not necessarily the main religion, Israel, Middle Eastern countries, etc., they also seem to be doing a lot better in keeping their faiths and also their roots and their traditions, etc., than we are in the West. Why do you think that is? Is it that life is too easy here and we don't really value things?
We've man has become a sort of psychological creature in the West, and we live in this kind of Freudian pit of it's all about me, which I think must be really the subtitle for pretty much everything in the charts at the moment. And I think that's a very hard place to be spiritual from. Whereas I think those other places that you've mentioned are more naturally geared to being centres of spiritual life. They have history and pedigree, and we do too. But we've spent the last, I think, 200-300 years unpicking that slowly from the Enlightenment and some of the darker aspects of the industrial revolutions that we've had. We have become this sort of inward-looking creature, and I think now to become a Christian really requires in catechesis, I think, considerable deprogramming from that to turn someone round to say life is not all about me and my fulfilment.
Yeah.
And do you know what? I think you could go to many school assemblies and find a sort of pastiche version of that, which is essentially selling that, you can be anything you want to be. Fine. But do you know, there's a way of doing that and sadly ignoring the whole idea that you're also part of this incredible civilization and you have a duty towards that civilization. And what is being passed to you is, hundreds of years of wisdom and expertise, and primarily, the Christian heritage. It's easy to edit all that out and say, yeah, it's just all about your career, and you can be anything you want. Well, that might not actually be the gospel that people need to hear. What if the good news is actually much more complicated and subtle? We'd had it all the time, but we've just decided to give this, again, I use the word marvelization of history. And I think those other countries are less adverse to that. We are increasingly becoming more allergic to the spiritual. I'm told that there's some facts, some data to show that not only have we become a less Christian society, but some of the other religious movements, say like the mind, body, spirit, New Age movement, is now getting less traction because the New Age thing's expensive. Crystals cost money. It's a bourgeois lifestyle, whereas just, looking at your phone for 8 hours a day on TikTok. That's easy. That's instant dopamine rush. How do you reach out to generations upcoming with the idea of faith, of heritage, of patriotism in all the best sense of the word, a love for your own history? If the culture has allowed us to just wallow in this sort of psychological pit, it's very, very hard. I mean, certainly we know that in the first couple of centuries, the Christians had to work really hard to de-paganize individuals from that sense that, my life is really not that. My life is I'm just a plaything of the gods. And my fate is of little importance unless I can get domination over someone else. So I'm in the pecking order. I think it's very difficult to, as it was then, to turn someone into a good Christian from that, just like it is in a way similarly now. And again, we're not having that theological conversation. We're having theological conversations that are easy. We're having debates about identity politics, climate change, whatever. We're not really. I think the danger is we've lost track of being doctors of the soul. Just at the moment when society needs it most.
So throughout the centuries, religions have required certain moral standards of people. I mean, obviously the very religious people followed them, but even the people who weren't very religious, they still had this basic level of morals they had to stick to. But now we're kind of reaching this post-religious age where people are moving away from it, or religions are teaching these new orthodoxies, environmentalism or whatever, and we get this world where anything goes. And what can we do to bring morality back to this kind of post-religious society?
This is a very difficult question, I think, and this is one that goes around, I think, round and round in the heads of many of us. But I had this conversation with someone this morning, pretty much around that. How fatalistic should we be about where we're going? Should we just, as people of faith, just say, well, let's just watch the whole thing crash? And maybe that's what it needs to do, that there's going to be this great deluge that will come in and wash everything away, on the back of hyperinflation, woke ideology, AI, nukes, the whole, we're going off the cliff edge, and well, we just have to batten down the hatches. I've got a certain sympathy for saying, well, perhaps this is the time for being ark builders, and maybe it'll be small communities in a couple generations coming out of exile that will build the better version of this. But I think also there's a part of me, and you see there's a conflict in me in here, because if you take from the 3rd chapter of St. John, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that the Christian church has an inbuilt compassion for the world. And we know that the Greek word for world is cosmos, which really translates as the system. God so loved the system, the culture, that he gives his only son, that he reorders the whole of society around Christ, the cross, the resurrection, the Gospels. And I think in the end, even if everything is going down, we still have to be, I think, compassionate, generous people living in the midst of it. I think it was St. Cypriot who commented that when the plagues came in Rome, the Christians stayed, buried not only their own dead, but that of strangers, yea, even adversaries. Whereas the gentrified ran to the hills. And I think we're going to have to do a lot of thinking about how we get that right. Yes, ark building, but also I think we have to be prepared to be with people in what could be, a time of very difficult change.
So however difficult it gets out there, we need to be good ourselves.
Good in ourselves, and generous enough to actually say, I'm going to stay with it. I think Paul Kingsnorth, the writer, says this about that we have to be, I think the Chinese have this expression, he said that cooked and raw barbarians, the raw barbarians, the ones on the outskirts of national life, like it was thought of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, and the cooked barbarians are those, in a sense, in the middle of things, but still carry a very distinctive lifestyle, which clearly winds up the Chinese Communist Party. And perhaps we have to have both. We have both of those. Now,
Daniel French, thank you for joining us on British Thought Leaders.
it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Lee.